Egypt was one of the earliest of the great civilizations which arose independently on Earth 5,000 years ago. And the fascination of its monuments and its gods is still undimmed today. To enter the Great Pyramid of Khufu in the dead of night is to come into contact with an absolutely unique sensibility, responsible for the most enigmatic and enduring creations of humanity. But at the heart of our modern response to the Egyptians is something deeper still, a basic need in the human soul to create a sense of solidarity with the universe, to overcome time and death itself. In our world, such ideas no longer figure as goals of civilization, but they're the key to understanding the culture of ancient Egypt. Over the last 20 years, we in the Western world have become painfully aware of how our well-being is inextricably bound up with that of nature. And that understanding has given us a fresh insight into the psychology of Egyptian civilization, their attitude to religious cult, to rulership, to the afterlife, and to the idea of the unchanging stability of the cosmos. And what more dramatic illustration can there be in the whole world than the Great Pyramid, and this room in particular, of the human yearning for immutability, for the human concern for life after death. And the fact that this place has the power to move us so much after so many millennia, whatever culture we come from, is a testimony surely not only to its grandeur of conception and execution, marvelous as that is, but also to the fact that we still share the impulse which lies behind it. And in that sense, we of the late 20th century, for all our modernity, are still Bronze Age people. This is a journey in search of the roots of Egyptian civilization. Its transformation by the Greek and Muslim cultures which overlaid it, and its continuing life in the ordinary people of today's Egypt. It is a search for what a great medieval Islamic historian called Egypt's habit of civilization. Do you really believe, wrote the novelist Tawfiq al-Hakim, that the thousands of years that make up Egypt's past could have vanished without trace, as if in a dream? The Nile, said the great Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, surpasses all the rivers of the world in sweetness of taste, in length of course, and utility. The civilization of Egypt, like those of Iraq, India, and China, drew its life from a river. But this was a country like no other. Running for 600 miles between dunes and cliffs, a narrow ribbon of blue water and green fields, on average only 6 miles wide. This geography shaped the civilization. Where the spirit of Iraq was pessimistic, here when the Nile flooded each year, as the ancients said, the fields laugh, men's faces light up, and God rejoices in his heart. From the life-renewing soil left by the inundation, the Egyptians drew a cheerful confidence in humanity, in the permanence and stability of things. Theirs was an optimistic civilization. Their civilization grew out of a long prehistory of culture in the Nile Valley. The coming together of many small egalitarian farming communities. Communities sustained as today by hard-working peasantry, tilling the soil, creating an elaborate filigree of ditches and dikes to capture the annual flood. The Aswan High Dam, built in 1970, may have changed this age-old rhythm. But today's Egypt still depends on the tillers, the fellahin, and what the ancients called the Black Earth. Not long before 3000 BC, these local cultures were unified into a single state, the first in history. And here at the very beginning, there are clues which will determine the shape of Egyptian civilization, right down to the Islamic period. Our search begins in an obscure little village in Upper Egypt called Qom el Ahmar, the Red Mound. This was the center of a prehistoric tribal kingdom, shrine of a local divinity called Horus, the Hawk, hence its Greek name, Hierakonpolis, Hawk Town.
This is the old kingdom town.
In 1897, two British archaeologists, Quibell and Green, came here, looking for the origins of Egypt.
About 20 years ago, the Americans came back to the same place.
In a field beyond the village, they made a stunning discovery, a heap of ceremonial pallets and mace heads from the ritual stores of Egypt's first kings. Kings called cobra, catfish, scorpion, hawk.
So the old kingdom temple is this whole area here, the temple of Horus.
Yeah.
Is that right? Didn't Egypt begin here? The first kings.
أول ملك
Did any of their fathers work on those excavations?
أباتكم كانوا شغالين معهم. Yes.
Among the finds was perhaps the most significant object ever dug up in Egypt. A slab of black slate 2 feet long, cut with scenes commemorating the deeds of a king called Narmer, whom legend said was the unifier of Egypt. Here is the very moment of Narmer's triumph. Wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, he dashes out the brains of the captive king of the Delta. Headless enemies lie in rows before the standards of Horus the Hawk, and already a superhuman aura surrounds the king himself, an aura of divinity.
90 years on, it's very difficult to see any trace of those momentous discoveries here in the area where the pallets and the mace heads were found. But a year later, Green made an equally intriguing find in the same area. He came across the remains of a large circular mound of clean white sand, about 50 yards across and 8 feet high, enclosed by a sloping sandstone revetment. There was evidence of a walkway leading to some central feature. Green thought the dating was prehistoric, before the first kings of dynastic Egypt, and he interpreted the mound as being a symbolic representation of the mound of creation itself, the first island which had risen out of the seas of chaos at the beginning of time, and on which the first life had landed, the hawk.
The divine kingship of Horus would last as long as ancient Egypt itself. Here in the great temple at Edfu, that same creation myth would be expounded in loving detail for colonial Greek overlords, nearly 3 millennia after Narmer's day. It was at the heart of the Egyptian conception of civilization. Every Egyptian temple, then, was a symbolic representation of that original mound of creation, with that simple reed shrine surrounding the perch on which the hawk had landed, which was created at Hierakonpolis. And no matter how big the temples became in later ages, the Holy of Holies was still that simple reed shrine, depicted here at Edfu 3,000 years later. You can make out the line of reeds surrounding the chamber in which the image of the hawk was kept. The temple was not only, though, a depiction of the first place, but of the first time, the time when the pattern of a stable society was handed down to humankind, of kingship, law, religion, and ritual, a pattern which it was believed would suffice for eternity as long as the rituals were correctly performed. The universe then and civil society were conceived of as static. Progress, change, new questions, new answers were not required because they were not needed. And indeed, they wouldn't be needed until Alexander the Great conquered Egypt 3 millennia later. For the Egyptians, then, divine kingship was the guarantee of a stable cosmos. The same idea can be traced across the world, from Shang, China to Aztec, Mexico. And here at Abydos, those first kings of Egypt were buried with immense brick mortuary temples, like earthly palaces. And so the key themes of Egyptian history were laid down. Centralized power, royal rituals, and the cult of the dead intertwined to form the ideology of the world's first state. Themes still potent, even in our own day. Moving northwards along the Nile, the narrow valley meets the green expanse of the delta. At this strategic point, close by today's capital, Cairo, the Horus kings built their royal city, Memphis. On the sandstone escarpment above the floodplain is the great funeral complex of the 3rd Dynasty kings. Here at Saqqara, the mud brick architecture of Abydos was turned into stone. An immense 200-foot-high tomb of King Jose, the first of the pyramids. In a handful of generations around 2500 BC, a series of gifted kings, Huni, Senefru, Khufu, Khafre, building bigger and bigger as each seems to try to outdo his predecessor, created the greatest series of funeral monuments the world has ever seen. The most famous, the Giza pyramids, are now all but engulfed by the suburbs of Cairo, stripped of their polished limestone casing and plundered for building stone, but still awesome. There are many myths surrounding the building of the pyramids. The Hollywood epic version had slave gangs whipped along by tyrannical masters. But Egypt was not a slave society. The mass of the workforce was not enslaved. In a long reign, it was perfectly possible for a government to mobilize huge-scale state employment to build such monuments, using the workforce in the wet season, when the Nile flood left idle hands.
From the graffiti and the quarries, we can get some idea of the character of the gangs who built these pyramids. The tough gang, the boys who stay forever, Khufu's boys. But exactly how it was done, there's very little evidence for. They must have worked from an enormous ramp running from the river. with feeder supports of wood and earth, perhaps to bring the stones round. The Greek traveller Herodotus, who came here in the 450s BC, said that he was told by tour guides that it took 20 years with the gangs of 100,000 men to do it.
The ancient Greeks, with typical cockiness, called them pyramids after the triangular cakes they knew back home. We can see them now in the light of the artificial mountains built by other cultures, Babylonians, Maya and Aztec. For all civilizations have sought validation for their power over the masses by creating great public symbols. But more than that, the dead king is now a manifestation of the sun god himself.
When the construction job was finished, the pyramids were covered with a case of fine Tura limestone. And although most of that has disappeared over the centuries, you can see over there on Khephrun's pyramid, the top coating is still there. That's what they looked like. But what were they for? They were tombs, but what did the shape mean? Well, the pyramid clearly was what it seems to be, a staircase on which the king's spirit could ascend to heaven and then go back to his tomb. And what we're looking at over here is an image of the rays of the sun god coming down to earth. A typical piece of the Egyptian imagination in which an immaterial concept is represented in such a material form. And on winter's days here in Giza, you can actually sit here and watch the sun breaking through the clouds and falling down at the same angle as the pyramids. A stairway to heaven then, the rays of the sun on which the king, nimble and wise, could ascend to the indestructible stars.
The Egyptians created the world's first unified state. In modern terms, it was a provider state, providing a basic standard of living to all its people through control of irrigation, in return for enormous surpluses to be spent on tombs, temples, and palaces. Through these great buildings, it expressed its ideologies of power, its belief in the indivisibility of divine and earthly rule, in the need for a stable cosmos. Such ideas may have been essential needs of civilization at the start. And yet even today, almost all of us still live in nation-states with some or all of those same characteristics. Our thinking is still shaped by their religious and social myths, and especially by the myth of the great ruler, king or god. For it was in his name in the Bronze Age that the many surrendered power to the few to live in the condition in which most of the people of the planet still live today.
Worship of the great ruler was perhaps a necessary stage in the development of civilization. But even now, in the TV age, kings and presidents and popes use the vast array of visual aids invented here and which we see all around us to boost their authority. And do we not still engage in ruler worship ourselves whenever we cheer a presidential motorcade as it sweeps by, or celebrate the jubilee of the Queen of England as she passes escorted by beefeaters in 16th century costume, or watch musketeers give an antiquated salute on the White House lawn? Perhaps then we are only just emerging from the spell of the Bronze Age revolution which created civilization and shaped our ways of thinking. In the long term in history, we are perhaps still too close to them to see ourselves as we really are.
In ancient Egypt, the ties binding people to the state were not only economic,
but religious. And the great event in its religious life was the pilgrimage to Abydos. Each year, thousands of people set out for the little town in Middle Egypt to celebrate the resurrection of Osiris, king of the dead. The pilgrimage provided a focus for the feelings of ordinary Egyptians, and rather like Hindus today at Benares or Shia Muslims at Kerbala, many asked to be brought to Abydos for burial. And at Abydos, we find another of Egypt's great legacies to the world. It's still a haunting place, cradled in an immense curve of the western cliffs, the realm of the dead. A holy place since prehistory. In the ruins of the sacred city, the Temple of Seti I, built in 1300 BC, still survives. It's one of the peaks of ancient art. Moving from daylight into its darkened inner sanctum, the visitor has an uncanny intimation of a still active residue of spiritual power. Long before the Christians and Muslims, even ordinary Egyptians came to believe in an eternal soul, in a last judgment, and in resurrection after death. These great conceptions were acted out in a public passion play at Abydos, and are depicted on the temple walls here as a rite of passage for King Seti himself. Here too are many motifs familiar to Christians, especially the role of the Divine Mother, Isis.
Here Isis is caressing Seti on her knee, and she says to him, "You're my son, come out of me. I have nourished you, that you may be lord of the two lands. I have made your body strong in victory against all the enemies who may come against you. Your majesty is king of eternity, a falcon abiding forever." And here's Isis giving the breath of life to Seti, and above her, her words are, "You have made your mansion, your temple, to magnify our nature, and adorned it with all kinds of excellent stonework. And your reward for this will be the lifespan of the sky, or as long as Abydos shall exist." At first sight, these gestures and actions may seem archaic and bizarre. But if you just step back a little and think, for example, what a Muslim or a Buddhist or even a Protestant would make of seeing for the first time a solemn Roman Catholic Mass, then a lot of those tender gestures, which are so familiar to Christians, would lose their meaning. In all religions in the world, simple and often strange gestures can carry profound truths. And it was just the same in Egyptian religion, which certainly did not lack ethical content. But the key to understanding the function of this great building lies in these little chapels just at the end of this room. In this inner shrine is the climax to the whole ritual. It's concerned with the installation of King Seti, not only as Osiris' heir as a living king, but with his union with Osiris after death. And here Isis and Horus perform rituals for him, and Seti is now dead and deified. Here he's represented as a mummy in a white wrap. And over there on the far wall, blackened by smoke and age, Seti, restored to the colours of living flesh and blood, comes into the presence of Osiris, where he will become one, resurrected himself, with the resurrected King of the Dead.
So the simple and strange gestures reveal a simple yet profound message. A belief in righteousness on earth, in the Last Judgment, in eternal life, though not in damnation, which had no place in the Egyptians' optimistic view of things. But these ideas would play a key role in the later development of Christianity and of Islam. Out in the desert at Abydos, millions of broken pots still lie where the ancient pilgrims left them as offerings to their god. For them, the wind roaring down the great gorge in the western cliffs was the sound of the spirits of the dead, whose annual pilgrimage to Osiris, they believed, would continue as long as Abydos exists. In 332 BC, Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great. And then Egyptian civilization turned away from its immemorial roots towards the sea and a wider world. For thousands of years, far back in time, even before the days of a united kingdom of Egypt, the Egyptians had looked no further for their contacts than Arabia and the Red Sea, Nubia in Africa, Syria and Palestine. But now, with the Greek conquest and the founding of Alexandria, a shift in the center of gravity of Egyptian history takes place. And for the next 1,000 years, they would find themselves part of a Greek-speaking Mediterranean world. This signaled the beginning of the end of traditional ancient Egyptian culture, which was transmuted by the dynamic, internationalizing culture of the Hellenistic age, which extended as far as Central Asia and formed one of the important foundations of the later Islamic world which followed. In all this, Alexandria was a great catalyst. As early as the 1st century BC, a Roman author could write that Alexandria is without doubt the first city of the civilized world, in size, in elegance, in riches, and in luxury. It's paradise here, said the poet Herodas. You can get anything you want. Money, shows, games, women, wine, boys, the best library in the world. In short, all earthly delights. Like 20s New York, Hellenistic Alexandria was a land of opportunities whose streets were paved with gold. It drew immigrants of all kinds. Bankers, clerks, engineers, poets, even religious dropouts. These extraordinary mummy portraits allow us literally to look into the eyes of such people. Even we feel to sense their hopes and fears. Vain and violent, rich and prosperous, it was said, they've only one god here, Mammon. Our good life in Alexandria was brief, read the poet Cavafi. But how potent were the perfumes, how splendid the bed on which we lay, and to what sensual delight we gave our bodies. Down here in the catacombs of Alexandria, you can still enter that weird and wonderful world where Egyptian and Greek and Jewish and Oriental religion and magic met and intermingled. The Greeks who came here to Egypt were very open-minded about the local gods. The deep experience of Mediterranean paganism made it easy for them to identify Amun with Zeus, or to say the Egyptians worshipped Aphrodite, the goddess of love, but they called her Hathor. And how that worked in practice, you can see in this astonishing tomb deep below the streets of Alexandria. At first sight, it looks like a typically Egyptian tomb with papyrus columns and the winged disk of the sun behind and the row of cobras' heads. But when you look closer, you notice human figures in ancient Egyptian poses, but with Greco-Roman faces. On each side of the door, guardian serpents, but carrying the snake-entwined staff of Hermes, the Greek guide of souls, and above them, Medusa's heads. And when you go inside the tomb itself, you can see that the sarcophagi are decorated with traditional Greek motifs, bunches of grapes, wreaths, cattle skulls, and masks. But above them are the ancient gods of Egypt. There's Isis protecting the sacred bull with her wings, and over here, Thoth, the god of wisdom, the falcon-headed Horus, tending to the mummy of the dead. And here even the jackal-headed Anubis, the guardian of the dead, wearing Greco-Roman military gear. This, then, is the strange synthesis that emerged in Greek Egypt.
It was said that Alexander had hoped to create a new world order based on his multiracial ideal of brotherhood among nations. In this, Alexandria would have been the cultural and commercial hub. But when Alexander died in Babylon, aged 32, the dream died with him. His body was brought back for burial in a lavish tomb in his new city. It's never been found. But the clues point to this tiny mosque in the heart of the old city of Alexandria.
An Arab traveller who came here in the 9th century AD described this place as the Mosque of the Two-Horned Prophet, a strange echo of the ram's horn helmet with which the Egyptian priests of Amun had crowned Alexander the Great. And through the Middle Ages, it was revered not only as the tomb of the prophet Daniel, which is still down there, but also as the tomb of the king and prophet Iskander, Alexander the Great himself. Tunnels and cellars that fan out from underneath this mosque have never been explored properly. But that's not really surprising. The city's absolutely honeycombed with them, and they're really dangerous. There's a great Alexandrian story of the fat bride who, on her wedding procession, fell through a hole in the street and disappeared, and despite the best efforts of the guests, she was never seen again. In 1850, a servant at the Russian consulate came down here and got lost in the corridors. When he came out, he said that he'd seen in a gap in the stonework a chamber with a glass coffin and a human body with a gold diadem round its head and fragments of papyrus everywhere. That description closely matches the last classical witnesses of the tomb of Alexander the Great. But suspiciously so. He was probably lying. Nevertheless, it's an intriguing thought that the solution to the greatest mystery in the history of Alexandria could lie somewhere behind one of these blocked-up corridors.
It's 3 a.m. in the remote monastery of St. Paul, near the Red Sea. The monks begin their devotions before dawn. These are Christian Copts. Their name means Egyptians, and their language and music contain survivals from pharaonic times.
Their culture goes back to the early centuries AD, when Egypt became part of a Christian Roman Empire. And even today, they represent nearly 10% of Egypt's population. This church was founded in the 3rd century AD by St. Paul the Anchorite. And with the Christians, we come to the second great foreign transformation of the native culture of the Nile Valley. In late Roman Egypt, an upheaval began as momentous as any political revolution, a change in the psyche of Near Eastern culture, which has helped shape the Western mind ever since. A vision of life which believed in withdrawal from the world. Monasticism. There are distant echoes of our own time here, of self-sufficient communes dropping out of society. And perhaps this too was a time of psychic threat. At this time, the blue water and emerald fields of the Nile Valley were exchanged for the inhospitable desert. There are strange parallels with our own time, in the widespread feeling that civilization itself had failed. Better cities may arise one day, said the Egyptian philosopher Plotinus. Our children, though conceived in a sinful age, may build better than their fathers. And so the old fabric of pagan culture, the stable cosmos which had sustained Egyptians for so long, was eroded by Christianity, with its appeal not to a great earthly ruler, but to a distant high god. This was a time, said one, when we realized how insecure the human condition is. These fateful changes were mirrored in the way people saw the world. For nearly 1,000 years, classical Mediterranean art had glorified the physical world in the belief that mankind, as the Greeks said, was the measure of all things. Now artists retreat into a crude language of symbols. To us, in the age of Freud and Jung, it looks like a failure of nerve, a loss of faith in the material world, perhaps even deeper psychic trauma. Everything has gone, said Cyprian. Honesty, friendship, skill in the arts, standards in morals. This vast and wonderful world is heading for destruction. And so, with St. Paul of Egypt, the stage was set for fundamentalists of all persuasions to fight over the legacy of the ancients.
Anachorites, chief of the Anchorites, born in the city of Alexandria, AD 228, died AD 343.
In the old towns along the Nile Valley, the ancient paganism survived right through the Christian era. Akhmim in Middle Egypt was and still is a famous textile town. Fragments of its cloth from the late Roman period suggest a rich mixed culture with their Greek, Egyptian and Christian themes.
It was the same in their prayers. Help us, they said. Help us, Horus, Adonis, Michael, Jesus. Amen. The town's most famous temple was to the phallic god Min. Described as a wonder of the world by early Arab travelers, it was destroyed in the Middle Ages. But now, for the first time, remains of this splendid building are emerging from deep below the streets. Still with a hint of a smile, a part of the pagan past is emerging again to the light of day. After the Roman Emperor Theodosius banned pagan rituals in 395 AD, the writing was on the wall for temples like this, even in a town which for centuries had prided itself on its broad church.
When the Greek traveller Herodotus came here to Akhmim in the 5th century BC, he reported that the inhabitants favoured Greek customs more than any other place in Egypt. And this was still true right up to the end of the Roman Empire and even the Islamic conquest. In fact, Upper Egypt was full of Greek literary figures like Olympiodorus of Thebes, who travelled as far as Ethiopia and the Black Sea with a faithful parrot who spoke Attic Greek and could pronounce his master's name. And here in Akhmim was a whole circle of pagan poets who travelled widely in the Eastern Empire. And in that atmosphere, it's not surprising that the Temple of Min here survived long after the Emperor Theodosius' edict against the pagans. In fact, there are cases in the neighbourhood of town councillors who went back to paganism, having been converted to Christianity. And that's the background to the situation that arose in the early 400s AD, when the militant Christian abbot Shenouda in the White Monastery over the river launched night raids with fanatical monks to beat up neighbouring pagan landowners here. And the crunch came when they attacked the Temple of Min itself, stole the statue of Min and the sacred books. But the standing of the pagan priests in the community was still great enough for them to take Shenouda to court and sue him for his vandalism. But that was pretty much the last throw of the old religion.
The ancient Egyptian symbol of life, the cross, would continue, but in other hands. All over Egypt, the temples were vandalized before conversion into churches. At Abydos, Christian fanatics chiseled away with careful malice at those intimate gestures which had connected ancient men and women with their old gods. An awesome revolution of the mind was now taking place. A movement from the worship of many gods to that of a single god. And out of this crisis emerged Islam. Islam was the final stage of the transformation of the religion of Abraham through the Jews and Christians to the last great world religion, proclaimed by the Prophet Muhammad. In 641 AD, after 1,000 years of Greek and Roman rule, Egypt fell to Muslim Arabs bearing the new faith of the Prophet Muhammad. And in the cities, the Prophet's message fell on fertile ground. Here in Edfu in Upper Egypt, the town of Horus, in the mud brick houses clustering around the temple, a rich series of business and legal documents lets us glimpse how the people responded to this tremendous change. As the cultural life of Egypt, after so long looking towards the Mediterranean, turned again to the Fertile Crescent.
And so, here in Edfu in Upper Egypt, as throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, the Christians and the Muslims were the inheritors of the ancients. And their belief in a single God, which the muezzins are chanting now from their minarets, developed out of a tendency long apparent in the ancient world. For the Catholic papacy, the Muslim caliphate, the Orthodox churches of the Greeks and Syrians and Copts all stem from the attempt of men to rule their fellow men and women under a distant, high and all-powerful God. And the effects of that tremendous revolution at the end of the late antique world still shape our lives today. The last Greek religious papyrus from 7th century Egypt sets the seal on that revolution. For it gives in Greek the very words we can hear around us now. In the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate, there is one God and one God alone. And it goes on in Greek, Mahmed, apostolos Diou. Muhammad is the apostle of God. With that, to all intents and purposes, the world of the ancient Egyptians had passed.
The change to Islam would take many centuries. And out in the countryside, especially in Upper Egypt, the deeper layers of the past are still visible today. It's the eve of the full moon in mid-March, heralding the onset of the heat of summer. And at this time, tens of thousands of people come in from the countryside to descend on the little town of Luxor for a great annual festival. Up here, people still celebrate the ancient feast days, the spring festival, the rising of the Nile, and especially the 40 days of mourning for the dead. But this is the biggest. It's a Muslim festival for an Islamic saint, but it takes place at a mosque inside one of the great pagan temples of ancient Egypt. The Coptic Christians take part too, for they also once had a church inside the temple. The saint himself, Abul Haggag, died in the 11th century, at the point when Islam was becoming the majority religion here. His tomb inside the mosque has been a place of pilgrimage ever since. As everywhere, orthodoxy may demand one thing, but what the people do is another matter. And in the worship of sheikhs and saints, the ordinary people, the fellahin, fill the void between their daily hopes and fears and that distant high God. The night is passed in passionate celebration with the traditional music and songs of Upper Egypt. The two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt were united by Narmer, the Hawk King, 5,000 years ago. But even today, there's still two lands, each with its own character and traditions. And a man from Cairo or the Delta would feel a stranger here tonight. Indeed, this is perhaps as near as we can ever get today to the ancient celebrations for the renewal of life each year with the resurrection of Osiris. Next day, the festival reaches its climax. The living descendants of the saint lead a huge procession around the ancient temple and its mosque, bearing representations of the coffins of Haggag and his sons. Bringing up the procession are Luxor's guild of ferrymen bearing boats. They're on trucks these days, but nonetheless, the ferrymen are discharging their traditional duty, just as their ancestors did thousands of years ago, when around the streets of ancient Luxor, They bore the boat of the sun god Amun. The day ends not in solemnity, but in carnival and license. The ancient legacy also survived in the city. Cairo, the mother of cities, as Ibn Battuta said. Its numberless buildings peerless in their beauty and splendor. The meeting place of travelers, shelter of the strong and weak, whose throngs of people surge like the sea. Founded in sight of the ancient capital Memphis and the pyramids of Giza and Saqqara, Cairo has long been the cultural capital of Arab Islam. And here too, even today, in its mosques and universities, we can still find a living link with the world of the pharaohs. A civilization conservative in character, like its ancient predecessor. Here in the Al-Azhar, the leading teaching mosque of Islam, older than Oxford or the Sorbonne, learning is still the study of the sacred texts, binding the land together as it did in ancient Egypt. In city and countryside, then, the modern Egyptians still do some of the things their ancestors did, for all the apparently cataclysmic breaks in their history. Now here in Cairo in the late 14th century, those questions were examined by the greatest of all Islamic historians, Ibn Khaldun. His concerns were the same as ours in these films, the nature of civilization, its rise and decline. He considered that settled, cooperative human life was the goal of civilization, that it went in cycles of growth and decay, like all forms of life. He thought, incidentally, that overconsumption in society was an inevitable cause of decline, but that under certain favorable conditions of geography and climate and the character and customs of the people, culture could acquire a rootedness that he called the habit of civilization. And in all history, Egypt was perhaps the best example of that habit. The pharaohs, he points out, had political power for 3,000 years. They were followed by the Greeks and the Romans, and then the legacy taken on by Islam. So the habit of civilization was continuous here. Nowhere else in the world was it more firmly rooted. And that perhaps explains Egypt's continuing cultural leadership in the Islamic world today. At the beginning lay the early Egyptian state. First comprehensive attempt in human history to satisfy the needs of men and women to live together in an ordered state with a degree of happiness and material well-being. And so far, it's been one of the most successful.
This is PBS.